When you think of Paul McCartney, you probably picture the charming, smiling face of the Beatles' golden boy, the one who wrote timeless love songs and brought joy to millions. But even someone as universally loved as McCartney had his battles, and one of the most heated conflicts in his life came not from a rival musician, but from someone much closer to home, Yoko Ono. Yes, John Lennon's partner was at the center of one of the ugliest and most personal feuds in Beatles history. While McCartney has always been diplomatic in public, insiders and old interviews reveal that he harbored a deep frustration, some would even say hatred, for Yoko Ono and the role she played in dismantling the world's most iconic band. The day the tension began, the Beatles had been struggling behind the scenes long before their official breakup in 1970. But when Yoko Ono entered the picture, cracks began to widen. McCartney, who had a perfectionist streak and often took the lead in studio sessions, suddenly found himself facing Yoko sitting right beside Lennon during recordings. For Paul, this was unheard of. The Beatles had always kept the creative space sacred, reserved only for the four of them. It wasn't that McCartney hated Yoko as a person at first. What fueled his resentment was her constant presence in the studio and her influence over John Lennon. Paul once admitted that her involvement disrupted the balance of the group, and he felt she was steering John away from the Beatles and into a world where Paul had little say. The clashes in the studio, Paul's frustrations weren't hidden. Accounts from the recording of Let It Be describe him losing patience, snapping at both John and Yoko as the sessions dragged on. For McCartney, Yoko represented everything that was pulling the band apart: creative disagreements, personal egos, and the crumbling bond between him and Lennon. One famous moment of tension came when Paul tried to push through his vision for songs, only to face resistance not just from John, but indirectly from Yoko as well. To Paul, it was like battling both of them at once, and he hated the idea that an outsider had suddenly become part of the Beatles' decision-making. Public feuds and harsh words. The bitterness didn't end when the Beatles split. During the 1970s, Paul and Yoko traded subtle, and sometimes not-so-subtle jabs through interviews and even in their music. Yoko once dismissed Paul's contributions, downplaying his talent compared to John. McCartney, on the other hand, hinted more than once that Yoko had been a major reason for the breakup, though he carefully avoided naming her outright in the early years. Still, fans and historians knew the truth. Paul felt betrayed. The bond he shared with John had been the creative heartbeat of the Beatles, and in his eyes, Yoko had pulled John away from him forever. Did they ever make peace? Surprisingly, yes, but it took decades. In later years, Paul softened his stance, admitting that while Yoko's presence had been disruptive, she and John genuinely loved each other, and he had to respect that. The two even appeared together at public events, though insiders say their relationship always remained polite rather than warm. Still, it's clear that the scars from that era never fully faded. For Paul, Yoko Ono will always represent the moment his world's greatest band fell apart, and the woman who stood in the way of the partnership he cherished most. Behind the music and fame, even legends like Paul McCartney have enemies, and in his case, none loomed larger than Yoko Ono. Their clashes changed the course of music history, leaving behind one of rock's most infamous rivalries. And while time may have softened the edges, fans will always wonder, what might the Beatles have achieved if Yoko Ono hadn't entered the picture?